Hey Vortex, when are you going to do a video comparing the Uniden R7 to the new Valentine 1 Gen 2? Now, this is the question that you guys have been excitedly asking ever since we got any new information here about the new V1 Gen 2. This was just released last week, and ever since then, we've been doing testing on it, we've been driving around with it. Those of us on the forums, we've been kind of sharing our experiences and seeing if other people are reporting the same things, and we're learning a lot about the new V1 Gen 2, and it's quite a bit better than the original V1. And now in this video, I want to give you guys, since it's what you're wondering, a quick comparison of what we know so far about the V1 Gen 2 versus the R7. Then, as we do more testing, this weekend I'll be out to do some Red Barn testing, and then next week I'll be taking the V1 on a cross-country road trip for 3,000 miles, and I'll also be running other detectors, switching between them to see how they compare. And then once we've got all the different testing that we need to do completed, and we're all getting pretty comfortable with the detector, then we'll do like a full review of the V1 Gen 2. We'll compare it to maybe the original V1. There's a lot more than just a new display and a new case under the hood. It is a much, much better detector. And then we'll do the comparison with the R7. We'll also be comparing it to the Max 360C that also has arrows, or the Redenso Pro M that up to this point has been known for having the best BSM filtering. So there's a lot more stuff that we'll do once we have all the information. But because we've been running the V1 here for the past week or so, and we've got some good idea of how it compares, let's go ahead and talk about how things are looking so far with the Uniden R7 versus the V1 Gen 2. Now, here's a look at the main highlights and differences between the two detectors and what we're going to be covering here in this video. Now, starting off when it comes to long distance range, the R7 has been the benchmark when it comes to performance, and it turns out the new V1 Gen 2 is no slouch. It looks like it's much better than the original V1. The Texas Countermeasure Testing Group has had a chance to do some testing, and on 33.8 they're finding that the new V1, it's more sensitive than the original V1 and actually closer now to the R7. On 34.7 in their test, the difference was even more dramatic. It's a bigger improvement, and again, closer to the R7. And then on 35.5, it actually traded shots with the R7 going back and forth, and the longest detection of the day on 35.5 went to the V1 Gen 2. Now on K-band though, the V1 is not able to keep up with the R7, and we think that actually has to do with some of the new filtering that's built in, but the V1 Gen 2 does lag behind the R7 in maximum performance capabilities, and then if you switch to big L mode or advanced logic mode, you'll see it drop down even further. Now, this is only one test, and we need to take a look at a lot of different tests to see how they compare. This weekend, as I mentioned, I plan on going out and doing my Red Barn testing with the V1 Gen 2, the R7, and a bunch of other comparable detectors. The forecast for this weekend is rain and snow, so fingers crossed that we'll be able to go out and do that test. But again, this is one test, and so far things are looking really promising here with the new V1 Gen 2. Now, long range is great. We definitely need that as a starting point, but with the new V1, the biggest difference that I'm noticing is actually the BSM filtering. The BSM filtering here on the new V1 is excellent. It looks like this is now the best new radar detector available on the market when it comes to filtering out false alerts. That was probably one of the biggest complaints about the R7 is people buy it because they're like, oh man, the range is awesome, yay! But then it falses a ton, and then they're kind of reliant on stupid hacks like K-Block to try to filter out the false alerts. Now, what we're finding is that the new V1 Gen 2 is much quieter and much better at filtering out false alerts than, well, the R7 or even the V1 Gen 1. The new V1 is able to filter out false alerts from many Mazdas, Hondas, and Acuras. You're able to drive right up to a lot of those cars with the BSM light turned on, and you won't get any false alert at all. Sometimes you may get a false alert to those cars, but if and when you do, it'll just be a very weak, brief alert. It's nothing crazy strong like with the other detectors, and you're not going to be picking it up from super far away like you may with the R7, for example. Some of the longer distance alerts seem to be happening from your GM vehicles, like your Chevys or your Cadillacs, for example, so it will still false to those, but again, the falses are a lot weaker and less often than you'll see with some of the other detectors. So the BSM filtering here is the best that I've seen out of any radar detector on the market, which is awesome. Again, it's not Thea, or what we're going to be expecting Thea to be like, but this is kind of the best filtering that we have currently available. Your results, of course, will vary depending on what cars are around you, so it's one of those things that we need to do a lot of testing on in different conditions and different people with different cars around. But again, the results are almost completely unanimous that, yeah, this is going to be much better than most other detectors from any other manufacturer. Next, another big difference is the fact that the R7 has GPS built in versus the V1, which does not have GPS. But the V1 has Bluetooth built in, so you can pair it with your phone, whereas the Uniden does not have Bluetooth. And that's interesting because that actually really changes the dynamics of the detectors. This one, because it has GPS built in, well, all the GPS stuff can just happen with the detector itself, versus with the V1, you're going to be more reliant on the phone for a lot of things. But if you're willing to pair it with the phone and run some third-party apps, a lot of times you can ultimately have an even better experience than what the V1 can do, or sorry, what the R7 can do on its own. So let's talk about that. So for example, when it comes down to programming the detector, with the R7, you do all the programming in the detector itself. With the V1, you can do programming of the detector, but it's not very intuitive and you don't have access to all the features. However, over Bluetooth, you can connect to the detector and it makes it super easy to change settings, and you can more easily switch profiles and change settings on the fly while you're driving without having to go and dive through any menu options. And so the R7 does a better job on its own. The V1 does a better job when you pair it with the phone. Similarly, because the R7 has GPS built in, it can alert you to things like red light cameras in the area. The V1 can't do that. But again, if you run an app like Waze or Google Maps, the apps are going to be able to tell you the exact same thing. GPS lockouts to filter out stationary false alerts from door openers or speed signs. That's a big difference as well. With the R7, you just double press the mute button on the side and it'll teach it that's a false alert, and it's going to be filtering it out for you automatically. With the V1, it's going to be different. The V1 doesn't have any GPS, so it can't do that. It's reliant on some of the filters like advanced logic mode, but that's not going to be able to do what GPS lockouts do. However, again, if you pair it with the phone and run a third-party app, you can get the GPS lockouts just like the Uniden, plus they're now going to be automatic, meaning instead of having to turn the detector and press a button on the side, the phone can just automatically figure it out for you and start telling the detector to mute and filter those out without you having to do anything. So again, the Uniden has the feature built in and it's manual. The V1 does not have the feature, but you can add it in with the phone and then it becomes more automatic and safer as well. So again, better with the phone if you're willing to use the phone, versus the Uniden doesn't have the phone, but it can do more on its own. It's similar, again, if we take a look at low-speed muting to keep the detector quieter around town. With the R7, simple. Just set your quiet ride, your low-speed muting, to a certain threshold, and then it uses GPS to mute any signals below that speed. The V1, there's no GPS. It can't do that. But if you purchase Savvy, it's an optional $69 accessory that plugs into your car's OBD2 port. It can track your vehicle's speed that way and mute the detector below a certain speed. Plus, it also works if you're in like a parking garage or something where you lose GPS. That's a nice benefit. If you want to rely on your phone, again, you got your phone's GPS that can tell your detector to mute below a certain speed, and then you wind up with the same functionality, just again, reliant on a phone or an external accessory. So again, it's going to function a little bit differently on how you execute it, and there's going to be different pros and cons to each solution. Do you want to run a phone with your detector or not? There's pros and cons to both, and I'm going to do a video going over all this in detail, as well as how you set it up, both for iPhone and Android, for those of you who want to do it, but not everybody wants to rely on a phone and would just rather have the detector do that themselves. Totally cool. Again, pros and cons to both, and I'll be covering that in more detail, but that's kind of how things stand with another one of the really big differences between the detectors. Now, another difference is the displays of the detector. The R7 has a multicolor OLED display, which can display a ton of useful information, including the frequency of the different signals you detect, versus the V1 has a simpler LED display that's only red and doesn't do different colors. However, if you want maybe a colored screen or a frequency display, again, pair the V1 with your phone and you're able to get that information too on a bigger phone screen instead of built into the detector itself. Pros and cons to both. But again, there we go. Now, okay, maybe moving on from some of the phone versus non-phone stuff, another big difference is the KA falsing. With the Uniden, you're not really going to get a ton of false alerts on KA band, versus with the V1 Gen 2, it looks like we are seeing some. We're getting a variety of different weak KA band falses while we're driving, plus there's kind of this weird thing going on that a number of people are reporting where when you drive by a police officer, it'll alert normally, but then a lot of times it'll just start throwing a bunch of extra false alerts on KA band, especially to the rear antenna. It may ramp up and say you've got 6, 7, 8, 9 KA band falses all behind you with this weird kind of ghosting thing that people are reporting. I've seen similar stuff actually testing with the Spectre, and people are also seeing the same thing actually driving around on the road as well. I haven't seen it myself yet, actually driving around, but a number of people have reported the same issue. So when it comes to filtering out false alerts on KA band, it looks like the Uniden is going to do a better job here. What about laser? This is another big difference between the two detectors, both in laser sensitivity as well as laser false alert filtering. Now, the Unidens have never really been known as having good laser sensitivity. Most people don't really care because laser sensitivity and, well, detection in the first place isn't really a big deal in practice. Laser jammers are really what you need to actually give you reliable protection. But if you're looking for laser detection, the Unidens are not that sensitive. The V1s historically have been the benchmark when it comes to laser sensitivity. The laser has been completely changed here in the Gen 2 compared to the Gen 1, so we're going to have to retest it. But again, the V1s have long been the benchmark when it comes to laser detection and laser sensitivity. So just based on that, I'm going to be giving the edge to the V1 in laser sensitivity. Now, when it comes to laser false alert filtering, again, the tide is going to go back to Unidens. You're not going to be getting a ton of false alerts on laser. Some people do report it from time to time. It can happen, but they're more occasional. On the V1, I get laser falses maybe every hour or two on average. I'll see laser falses from the typical offenders like your Mazda CX-5s, your Infinities that are driving by. It turns out the laser filtering was one of the big issues on the V1 Gen 1, and that was not improved at all here on the Gen 2. And so I plan on actually turning off laser detection here on the V1, despite the likely better sensitivity on laser, just to cut out all the false alerts that I've otherwise been getting. So with laser, the Uniden is less sensitive, but fewer false alerts. With the V1, probably more sensitive, but way more false alerts. Trade-offs. Either way, I guess ultimately rely on laser jammers. That's what you actually need to protect you from laser, but that's how things stand here in terms of laser detection comparison. Next, moving on to our low-powered radar, like your MRCD, your MRCT, etc. The Uniden is able to detect it and does a pretty good job here, especially with the latest firmware. The V1 Gen 2 wasn't even designed to detect him in the first place. The V1 Gen 1 was really not useful at all against the multi-radar, and the Gen 2, it wasn't designed for that. Maybe they could add that in later in a future firmware update, kind of like how they did with improving things with the R3 and then now the R7, but I would not rely on the V1 for any sort of multi-radar detection. So in terms of future-proofing from the newest low-powered radar stuff, the R7 is going to be the best. But again, there's still a lot more testing that needs to be done. Maybe the V1 will work great, but I kind of doubt it. But again, we've got more testing to do to see how all this stuff actually works. Next, taking a look at RDD immunity and stealth. The Uniden R7 in my testing is not going to be stealth to the Spectre. Depending on what Spectre you're using and what copy of the detector you have, I would not say that the R7 is going to be totally stealth and undetectable to the Spectre 3 or Spectre Elite. It does better against the Spectre Elite. The Spectre 3 seems to be more sensitive. With the V1 Gen 2, on the other hand, this one against my Spectre 3, yeah, it is stealth. In my testing, I get maybe 2 feet of detection range or so. And so in this case, if you're running the V1 Gen 2, it looks like the officer is not going to be able to detect if you're using the V1 Gen 2. So that actually is a stealth detector from what we've seen so far. I haven't had a chance to test it against the Spectre Elite. When I get one on hand, I'd be happy to do that testing, but from what we've seen so far, testing with the Spectre 3s, it looks like the V1 Gen 2 is stealth, whereas the R7 is not. So that's not something that most people need here in the US, but maybe in Canada or in other countries, that is going to be an important feature, and the V1 Gen 2 will do a better job, even though it's not going to be able to detect the MRCD that's used up in Canada. So again, we've got a bunch of trade-offs here, right? Now, finally, taking a look at price. Both detectors should be around $499 or so, but the R7, you can actually find it now typically around $449 or so. Price has definitely been fluctuating here with the R7s, but you've been able to get it pretty consistently around $449. The V1 Gen 2 retails for $499. So based on what current pricing is like, the V1 is going to be $50 more, but they're pretty close in pricing. And really the biggest differences between the detectors is things like the R7 can just do more things on its own. Great performance, GPS lockouts built in. GPS is built in, and it's got the MRCD and whatnot. So again, it just does a better job on its own versus the V1. Okay, maybe it doesn't have GPS, but it's got Bluetooth. And so you can pair it with your phone to get GPS lockouts, which are automatic. Plus the BSM filtering is definitely going to be better than the R7. Can't get the red light camera alerts, but you can get those through an app. So if you're willing to pair the phone, or willing to pair the detector with the phone, which isn't a huge deal, not everybody wants to do it, but if you're willing to do the phone pairing and run an app, a lot of times you can have a better ultimate experience with the V1. So again, pros and cons to both, and there's still a lot more testing and a lot more real-world driving that needs to be done. But based on what we're seeing so far, that looks to be kind of how things stand and what we're looking at between the V1 Gen 2 and the Uniden R7. So yeah, there we go. I know it's something that you guys have been super curious about. And I mean, again, this stuff just came out, so we're still learning it and doing a bunch of testing, but that's how things stand so far. So, whew, yeah, that's it for now. Hopefully this has been helpful for you guys. Let me know if you have any additional questions, and once we've got more information, more testing, I'll be doing more in-depth reviews and comparisons between all these different detectors. But V1 Gen 2 versus R7, that's how things stand now. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next video.